Around the year 30 AD, Jesus of Nazareth was arrested in Jerusalem and condemned to the cross. As his terrified disciples fled, it fell to Joseph of Arimathea, a secret follower, to bury Jesus' broken body.
Joseph wrapped it in fresh linen and laid it in his own new tomb, which had been hewn from a formation of rock. Then he rolled a huge stone across the entrance of the tomb and went away.
And there, the story might have ended, but in fact, it was only just beginning. According to the Gospels, 3 days later, Jesus' grieving mother and Mary Magdalene witnessed a confounding sight.
They found the stone rolled back from the tomb, but when they entered the tomb, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus.
Belief in that empty tomb helped launch Christianity as a world religion. Yet the sacred symbol of resurrection soon vanished in a cataclysmic event. In 70 AD, about 40 years after the death of Jesus, Roman legions burned the holy city of Jerusalem. Somewhere beneath the smoldering ruins lay the unmarked tomb of Jesus, lost and forgotten. Until 300 years later, when a determined woman came searching for the site. Her name, Helena Augusta, the mother of the first Christian emperor of Rome, Constantine the Great.
She is, in a sense, the first archaeologist. She not only establishes the tradition that this is where it happened, but she also digs down through the layers and in Jerusalem excavates to find the site of the Holy Sepulchre.
"1,700 years later, pilgrims can still see and touch the actual church built to commemorate the grave said to be discovered by Helena.
From here one enters into the rotunda, which is the focal point, the main point of the church. In the heart of the rotunda stands today a chapel which marks the burial of Christ itself. The dome is modern, while the pillars surrounding it are restored, but they are original, dating back to the time of Emperor Constantine, i.e. 4th century AD.
To the faithful, this is the tomb of Christ. But was Jesus really buried here? The answers may lie with Helena's incredible journey of faith and discovery, the very first Christian pilgrimage to the Holy Land. It began in the autumn of 326. Although nearly 80 years old, Helena made the arduous passage from Rome to Palestine, surrounded by a small army of courtiers, soldiers, and officials. Among them was Eusebius, the bishop of Caesarea, who would immortalize her journey.
The empress wished to pay due reverence to the ground which the Savior's feet had trodden, according to the prophetic word which says, "Let us worship at the place whereon his feet have stood."
In her quest to walk in the footsteps of Jesus, Helena experienced astonishing success. In fact, despite the passage of 300 years, she identified the site of Jesus' baptism on the Jordan. Then, at the Mount of Olives, she kneeled where Jesus first uttered the Lord's Prayer. And in Bethlehem, she unearthed the very cave of the Nativity. For the next 1,700 years, countless pilgrims would venerate these sites.
Well, certainly she's very important in establishing the holy sites. She started many of the traditions in the 4th century, but whether or not they're true is another question.
I think the only site that has a good chance of being authentic is where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is located.
Beneath the Church of the Holy Sepulchre lies one of the most intensely debated issues in New Testament archaeology. And it is the place where Helena's legend reaches its climax.
As the story goes, Helena goes to Jerusalem to try to find the site where Jesus resurrected. Well, she looks for the grave in Jerusalem, and she asks locals if they know of the tradition where it is, and some of them do point out that, in fact, they believe it's right underneath a temple that was built, a Roman pagan temple.
200 years earlier, in 132 AD, the Emperor Hadrian had leveled Jerusalem and built pagan temples atop sites held sacred by both Jews and Christians. In particular, some scholars suggest the temple to Aphrodite may have been built to intentionally obscure Jesus' grave.
People didn't like Christians. They were responsible for disturbing the Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods. And it seems to me that it would have actually made sense for Hadrian to want to stamp out something that was meaningful to the Christians in Jerusalem.
According to legend, Helena ordered the temple to be pulled down, and there she began to dig.
So they excavate and go down layer by layer until at the very bottom they find a series of tombs and shaft tombs, typical Jewish tombs, and in one of those it was believed that Jesus resurrected.
Constantine ordered the Bishop of Jerusalem to spare no expense building a church worthy of this site. That the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was built by her son during her lifetime is undisputed. But what scholars continue to debate is whether Helena Augusta discovered the actual grave of Jesus.
So there's no connection historically between Helena, the building of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the finding of the tomb, no historically reliable connection. All connections are legendary.
The story is not purely legendary. We're quite sure that Helena did find a first-century tomb on the site where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is currently located. Because if you go there today, just off of the main rotunda in which the shrine to the tomb of Jesus stands are the remains, and it's unmistakable. They are the remains of a first-century Jewish burial caves.
There's a saying in archaeology that you find what you're looking for. So if you're looking for the tomb in which Jesus resurrected, and you dig and you find a tomb, it becomes in your mind the tomb in which Jesus resurrected. Now certainly you found a tomb, but whether it's the right tomb, whether the resurrection happened, those are different questions.
And what of the equally complex questions about the beginning of Jesus' life, just 6 miles down the road from Jerusalem? Can archaeologists find the cave where, according to the Gospels, a young virgin gave birth to her firstborn son? The story of Jesus begins with a journey, a week-long journey across ancient Palestine.
And so Joseph went from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to David's town of Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to register with Mary, his espoused wife, who was with child.
As told in the Gospels, after the grueling trek to Bethlehem, and in the most humble circumstances, Mary gave birth to a child she named Jesus. 300 years later, the Empress Helena Augusta arrived in Bethlehem. When locals informed Helena that a pagan shrine obscured a cave long known to be the birthplace of Jesus, she ordered the temple felled. And when the superfluous rock was quarried away, a cave was revealed. Under Helena's supervision, a church was built over the sacred site. 17 centuries later, Christians from around the world still come here to the Church of the Nativity to celebrate the birth of Christ. But is this an authentic historical site? Was Jesus born in Bethlehem?
I myself do not know of any archaeological evidence that Jesus was born in the grotto beneath the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem.
Well, Jesus may very well have been born in Bethlehem of Judea, as the Gospels of Matthew and Luke say. They may know some reliable and historically trustworthy information here. I think it's presumptuous to rule it out and say that it's nothing more than myth and tradition.
This debate is far from new. In fact, it began in the 19th century, along with an epic quest for the historical Jesus. At that time, the Gospels were in essence the only source of information.
Using the Gospels for historical research on Jesus is a little bit like trying to look through a stained glass window. Stained glass windows aren't made for looking through. They're made for looking at. They are works of art. And so are the Gospels. They're works of literary art. The people who made them didn't intend that we would sit here asking our historical questions 2,000 years later.
In the 20th century, many scholars concluded that the Gospels alone might never fully reveal the past.
The new historical quest for Jesus was running into dead ends because what you had were really 4 documents, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, was that we were simply reshuffling the same evidence over and over and over again. And I began to wonder myself, and as it turned out, so did a lot of other people, about, do we have any new evidence to help us in solving all of these mysteries about the historical Jesus?
There was, in fact, new evidence in the ground. In the 20th century, the relatively new field of archaeology hit its scientific stride. Scholars with a Bible in one hand and a spade in the other headed for the Holy Land. There, Bethlehem was among the first places examined. The Franciscan Order of Friars Minor, custodians of many of the Christian holy sites since the 13th century, pioneered excavations at Bethlehem. Some historians believe they unearthed solid proof of the Nativity.
I do believe that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. The archaeological evidence that we do have shows that the caves beneath the church were actually occupied for stabling and storage in the 1st century, just at the time when we postulate they're being used for the birth of Jesus.
Above those ancient caves, the Franciscans uncovered layers of churches dating to Helena and the 4th century. But does the site's antiquity prove its historical authenticity?
There is an absolute difference between an historical site and what you might call a liturgical site, where something happened and where something is celebrated. For example, when the Empress Helena comes with a lot of money to build you a church, you don't tell her, well, Your Imperial Highness, we're not certain where it happened. You say, this is where traditionally we have celebrated it. That's where you build a church, and that's where you go to celebrate the fact, even if it did not happen there.
Other historians argue local Christians knew exactly where to take Helena.
The memory of Christians in the Holy Land was very much attuned to specific historical memory. Remember that for them, the event of Jesus was God becoming man, so that the physical circumstances of the life of Jesus were actually very important. What is emphasized in Bethlehem is the cave in which Jesus was born. So to me, that is tied to a very specific local memory.
Archaeology may not be able to resolve this debate. The Church of the Nativity in the war-torn West Bank is now closed to further excavation. But a startling new archaeological discovery may indicate Jesus was indeed born in Bethlehem, but not the one in Judea.
I think that Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Galilee, which is within easy walking distance of Nazareth, the place where he grew up.
While studying the Old Testament, historian Bruce Chilton made an astonishing discovery, a reference to a previously unknown site called Bethlehem, a village in Galilee, 100 miles away from the traditional Church of the Nativity, in Judea. If Joseph were a native of this Bethlehem, the gospel account would make more geographical sense. Instead of taking Mary 100 miles across Palestine at the end of her 9th month of pregnancy, Joseph would simply have taken her a short distance from Nazareth to his home in a neighboring village. Israeli archaeologists digging near the modern-day village of Bethlehem in the Galilee discovered evidence to support Chilton's theory. Stone vessels, unique to the Jewish material culture of Palestine. These vessels are universally accepted by archaeologists as ethnic markers, proof of 1st century Jewish inhabitation of a site. Are these discoveries strong enough to contradict 2,000 years of tradition?
archaeology can't confirm or deny whether Jesus was born here or there, Bethlehem in the Galilee or Bethlehem in Judea. There's no way when you find a house, a cave, a manger, that you could determine archaeologically that this is in fact the site where Jesus was born.
The location of the Nativity may always remain in the realm of mystery and faith. But not so in Jesus' childhood. If there's one place we can be certain Jesus walked, it's here, among the fields and rolling hills of Nazareth. Today's Nazareth is the largest Arab town in the Galilee. It overflows with pilgrims from around the world. Here they come to pray in the city most associated with the life of Jesus. Scholars and theologians generally agree that it was here Jesus was raised in the Jewish tradition and learned his father's trade. But some scholars go farther, contending that Jesus may have even been born in Nazareth, not in Bethlehem.
Instead of looking and trying to determine, is this the site where Jesus is born? Is that the site where Jesus is born? What archaeology should do is try to reconstruct the whole world in which Jesus lived, to try to understand his life and his teachings.
If one seeks to understand Jesus' milieu, Nazareth, where he was raised, is clearly a good place to start. Here, as in Bethlehem, the Franciscans began to excavate early in the 20th century. Their digs provided some insight into the village of Jesus' youth.
We know enough now through the work that's been done to know that it's a small town, that it's a peasant town, maybe 300 or 400 people living there during Jesus' day.
As the town expanded over time, much of the ancient village was paved over and archaeological excavations were limited. In 1997, work began on Nazareth Village, a multi-million-dollar recreation of Jesus' hometown. As a prelude to construction, the developers commissioned a routine archaeological survey. But when archaeologist Ross Voss conducted a preliminary study of the site, his findings proved anything but routine.
We discovered that there were many, many terraces here, and we found the wine press still partly buried under the soils, and so we knew immediately that there were some antiquities here, and we decided this would also be a good place to excavate.
Despite the presence of this very old wine press, Voss never expected to find anything of the 1st century. Yet, with an exploratory probe, skepticism turned to astonishment.
This is part of a jar. Here's another little jug, which could have held water or wine. This is the handle of a cooking pot. But this is the crucial evidence that we have that enables us to date the deposition or the placement of these soils and the farming of these soils. We know from the exclusive material of the 1st century here that this was the primary period when the terraces were created and being used.
Voss had inadvertently stumbled upon the fields farmed during Jesus' lifetime. A full-scale excavation began revealing much about daily life in 1st century Nazareth.
All right, here we have on my right a basin where the grapes would have been kept waiting to be pressed here in the middle of this pressing floor, which is a square area carved or hewn out of the bedrock itself. And as the grapes would be trod by maybe 2 or 3 people, the juice then would start running down and feed into this vat. And for the first 2 or 3 days, the grape juice would be allowed to ferment, and this would begin the process of changing the grapes into wine.
Even a casual glance at the Gospels reveals a Jesus deeply familiar with this agricultural life.
I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine grower. He prunes away every barren branch, but the fruitful ones he trims clean to increase their yield.
So all of this imagery then has to come, imagine, from personal experience. And all of that experience would come right here on the hillside itself, outside the village of Nazareth.
Yet scholars had long struggled to make sense of one agricultural reference in particular.
A man planted a vineyard, put a hedge around it, dug out a vat, and erected a tower. Then he leased it to tenant farmers and went on a journey.
Assuming watchtowers had no place in an agricultural field, many scholars believe the tower of this parable to be a later injection into the gospel story, until Ross Voss made an amazing discovery.
Well, as I head up this hill, which is heavily eroded, and we have a lot of exposed bedrock where the terraces had collapsed and the farm soils had washed away, we do have at this step here one of the preserved terraces coming over to meet a large watchtower. And this particular tower is just about 6 meters away from another watchtower lower down on another terrace step. And behind us then, the largest tower.
Voss had discovered not one, but 3 first-century watchtowers in the fields of Nazareth. Why were they here? What were they guarding?
The purpose of the towers was to protect the crops in the harvest season. Usually in August, when the grapes were ripe and ready to be picked for pressing and turned into wine, it was often a temptation for neighboring farmers on their different plots to steal from their neighbors so that they could get an extra amount of produce that they might be able to pay their taxes with. So in these months, or September and October, then when the olives would be ripe and they would be harvested, people would actually live in the towers throughout the day and the night and over these months to make sure that no one was going to steal from them.
These ruins are an echo of the past, of the all-consuming struggle for existence that defined the lives of first-century peasants. Peasants like Jesus of Nazareth.
Someone like Jesus would have been coming here on a regular basis to help with the harvest, to help with the maintenance of the terraces, to tread the wine press, to get the olives and crush the olives for pressing the oil. Anyone from the village who spent most of their time outside the village and into the fields, undoubtedly Jesus was here.
But was this Jesus' whole world? One of the most astonishing finds of the 20th century indicates Jesus' youth may not have been confined to the watchtowers and fields of Nazareth after all.
If you had come to Nazareth when Jesus was 20 years old and said, "I'd like to speak to Jesus," I think they probably would have said, "Well, he's over there at Sepphoris."
After the Nativity and a passing mention of Jesus' childhood in Nazareth, the Gospels fall silent. When we next meet Jesus, he is around 30 years old and about to be baptized. In this gap lies the lost youth of Jesus. An age-old desire to fill in the missing pages of Jesus' biography has produced stories as fanciful as a teenage Jesus traveling to India to exchange wisdom with the Buddha. Ironically, a modern archaeological discovery indicates Jesus may have only needed to walk an hour away from home to enter a completely foreign world. Jesus may have spent his youth in the cosmopolitan city of Sepphoris. In 1931, pioneer archaeologist Leroy Waterman uncovered ancient Sepphoris, just 7 miles from Nazareth. Although the city had long been known from rabbinic literature as a center of Jewish life and learning, Waterman was surprised to discover the remains of a Roman-style metropolis.
We are standing now at the central part of the Colonnaded Street, the main road where charts were driving in antiquity, and then on either side we have the sidewalk paved with mosaics, and where the sidewalk were covered with the columns which support the roof that was laid above the sidewalks, and then we have the entrances to those stores which were constructed here along the main street of Sepphoris.
When Waterman tentatively dated this sophisticated city to the time of Jesus, it sent shockwaves throughout the world of New Testament scholarship.
The first phase of the excavation revealed how urban and what a metropolis Sepphoris was. And then we realized Jesus did not grow up in rustic isolation.
What happens now when Sepphoris is brought into the picture is that it shows that right next to Jesus, there was a thriving, cosmopolitan, urban site that would have had profound impact on Jesus' Galilee.
In the year 4 BCE, Sepphoris was the hub of a Jewish revolt against imperial domination. According to the 1st century historian Josephus, the Romans responded to the uprising with speed and severity.
The Roman captain put those that met him to fight, and took the city Sepphoris, and burnt it, and made slaves of its inhabitants.
Less than 10 years later, Sepphoris rose again from the ashes, this time as the new imperial capital of the Galilee.
You had a whole city being rebuilt, and it was being rebuilt right during the days of Jesus' childhood and young manhood. To me, it seems logical that he and his father Joseph, a carpenter, are over there doing the work.
Jesus is called in the Gospels a tekton, someone who works with their hands. And traditionally, we've thought of that as being a carpenter. As the theory goes, he may have been actually a stonemason, working, of course, with his hands, and would have been actively working in the building projects at Sepphoris with his father Joseph.
So I would say if you had come to Nazareth when Jesus was 18 years old or 20 years old and said, I'd like to speak to Jesus, I think they probably would have said, well, he's over there at Sepphoris. I don't know for sure, but I suspect that's where he was.
The idea of the young Jesus absorbing Greco-Roman culture while working in Sepphoris revolutionized New Testament scholarship. But according to Zev Weiss, current director of excavations at Sepphoris, it was Jesus' possible connection with the Roman-style theater that stirred the greatest controversy.
We can see here a good picture of the cavea, the auditorium, on which 4,000, 5,000 people, residents of Sepphoris, and also people who are coming from outside Sepphoris, from other villages, used to come and watch the performances held in the city.
Now, one possibility is that Jesus would have gone to the theater, and that's where he would have picked up this notion of hypocrite.
The Greek word hypocrite appears 17 times in the New Testament teachings of Jesus.
When you are praying, do not behave like the hypocrites who love to stand and pray in synagogues in order to be noticed.
Hypocrite in Greek means simply a stage actor. Jesus uses that to attack his enemies, and he accuses people of putting on faces, putting up facades, as it were, being actors rather than being truly devout to God. There is that possibility. The problem is, however, that the theater might not date to the time of Jesus. It might date to after Jesus.
The dating of the theater figures prominently in a contentious phase of digging that began in the 1980s, 50 years after its initial discovery. Although a new generation of archaeologists still viewed Sepphoris as critical to understanding Jesus' formative influences, they disagreed with earlier scholarship on this critical question. Was Sepphoris a Greco-Roman city or Jewish city when Jesus was growing up nearby?
Over the years of excavating at Sepphoris, my mind changed from the site being Hellenistic and Roman in the sense of numerous Gentiles living there, to seeing it as a site that was very much a Jewish city which had adopted a Hellenistic and Roman architectural veneer. One of the key things that led me to change my mind is in building after building, we found stone vessels which are peculiar to Jews in the 1st century. We found in building after building, mikvaot, or Jewish ritual baths.
We're standing next to two Richard bath mikvaot, which are dated to 1st century and mostly to 2nd, 3rd century CE. And you have one mikveh, Richard bath over here, one example, and another example over here. Those two mikvaot belong to two different houses where you have a wall in between them. The fact that we have here more than 20 mikvaot indicate the population living in this area were mostly Jewish in identity.
When they also unearthed 1st century coins, religious artifacts, and tombs, all with typical Jewish imagery, Weiss was convinced earlier archaeologists had been mistaken. 1st century Sepphoris was a Jewish city. Yet why would a Jewish city have a Roman-style theater? In Weiss's opinion, in the time of Jesus, it didn't.
There's no way to connect between the theater and certain phrase in New Testament indicating that Jesus visited Sepphoris or Jesus visited or took part in constructing the theater. Archaeological evidence clearly indicate that we're talking about a later period.
According to Weiss, artifacts found beneath the theater definitively date its construction to the late 1st or early 2nd century. Likewise, the colonnaded streets and villas of Sepphoris were built at least 40 years after Jesus' death. Although it now seems 1st century Sepphoris was not the Greco-Roman metropolis scholars once imagined, it was still a city, and as such, had a profound influence on Jesus' Galilee.
The Romanization, the urbanization, and the commercialization of Galilee hit Lower Galilee hard by about the year 20. So I'm not surprised when two popular movements, the baptism movement of John and the kingdom movement of Jesus, arise in the 20s. Cities were not good news for peasants.
In fact, new cities like Sepphoris put enormous pressure on the peasants of the Galilee. Cities meant ever higher taxation, poverty, and ultimately, loss of land.
When Jesus in the Gospel says, "Blessed are the poor," does this mean blessed are the poor in spirit, and it becomes a spiritual concern? Or does it mean blessed are you poor, the people of a socioeconomic class who are feeling dispossessed? When you conduct archaeological excavations, and when you look at the sites of Sepphoris and Nazareth, you get the sense that there was not only poverty on one hand, but also considerable wealth that was located in the city. And a blessing to the poor aligns Jesus socially and also politically with the latter.
Even if he never set foot in Sepphoris, Jesus could see and feel its impact all around him. And so, when Jesus first heard the words of a wilderness preacher who railed against injustice, he knew he had found his kindred spirit, the prophet John the Baptist. About the year 20 AD, a prophet emerged in the Judean wilderness. His name was John, and he called on the people of Israel to repent and be baptized in the Jordan River.
John was preparing people for the imminent advent of the avenging God. God is coming any day now to make of this unrighteous kingdom of Rome a righteous, just, non-violent kingdom.
That John the Baptist is an historical figure is well attested. Not only the Gospels, but Josephus as well describe him as a holy man living in caves, wearing camel's hair clothing, and eating only wild honey and locusts. And all four Gospels also agree on this: Jesus was among the multitudes baptized by John.
If there are two things I'm sure about as a historian that happened to Jesus, one is that he was baptized by John the Baptist, and two is that he was crucified.
After Jesus was baptized, he came directly out of the water. Suddenly the sky opened, and he saw the Spirit of God descend like a dove.
For over a millennium, pilgrims have venerated a spot on the west bank of the Jordan as the place of Jesus' baptism. But startling new evidence may indicate this site, located in present-day Israel, may have been the wrong place all along. In 1999, Jordanian archaeologist Muhammad Wahib made an inflammatory claim. He'd found the real site of Jesus' baptism on the east bank of the river in Jordan.
We must tell the people the truth that we discovered the site. We are not competing with the other side, either the Israelis or the Palestinians. We're just looking for the truth, and we found it.
Wahib's certainty rests on one of the richest archaeological troves ever discovered in the Middle East. One he came upon in 1996, when Jordanian army officials informed him of ruins in a no-man's land that had been long given over to landmines and weeds. Digging along a now dry riverbed, Wahib was astonished to discover the remains of not one, but 3 5th and 6th century churches, built one on top of the other.
So we have really here the altar of the church, and the mosaic floor, which was remains from the destruction.
Wahib quickly became convinced these churches were built by Christian Byzantine emperors to commemorate one of the most important sites in Christendom.
The Byzantines think that Jesus Christ stood there with John the Baptist. So this is a sacred spot for the Byzantines. And those, they know the exact location where the Lord was baptized. Then we have a staircase connected with this church, leading down more than 22 marble steps, reaching a wide flat area down near the water where the Byzantines expected the Lord stood there. And we discovered on the wall more than 1,000 cross signs. All these signs is good evidences that Christians want to commemorate themselves when they baptize, and scratching these crosses on the wall.
Wahib had found evidence of pilgrimage. What began with Helena in the 4th century grew exponentially in the following centuries. Despite grave dangers and severe conditions, thousands of pilgrims journeyed to the Holy Land, where facilities were built to receive them. A short walk from the riverbed baptism site, Wahib found the remains of one such pilgrim station in the shadow of a hill known to the local Arabs as Elijah's Hill.
In the pilgrim station, you have rooms to sleep, you have a kitchen, and sometimes you have a prayer hall, a small church or chapel. And the next day, they will wake up and continue their pilgrimage up to Elijah's Hill.
In an ever-expanding excavation, Wahib now turned his attention to Elijah's Hill. To his astonishment, he discovered extensive and fascinating ruins, including 3 churches, a monastery, and enormous baptismal pools.
And here you can have a look on that pool, and they built here steps. And those steps designed to facilitate the movement of the pilgrims and believers to come in. And then to go into the pool, there is 4 wide steps. So if you want to enter Elijah's Hill, you must come here first, bath yourself, clean yourself, make immersion baptism, and then continue your pilgrimage to the churches, to the saints, and then to the holy events on Elijah's Hill.
But why did Christian pilgrims leave the riverbed baptism site to visit Elijah's Hill, the place where, according to tradition, the Old Testament prophet Elijah ascended to heaven?
Because Elijah came here, John the Baptist came here.
For Wahib, all the pieces were falling into place. This was the area described in the journals of ancient pilgrims as being populated by cave-dwelling hermits and monks who, at least as far back as the 3rd century, had come to live in the wilderness of John the Baptist.
We have now remains of 3 caves built on the western side of Elijah's Hill. They cut the rock and they carved the 3 caves. The monks lived here from the 1st century AD when John the Baptist started his mission and preaching here in this wilderness, and he prepared the disciples for Jesus Christ. So he started his mission here, and during that time they haven't palaces or they haven't houses, they just have caves to live in as hermits. So we discovered here really remains of the hermits who lived like John the Baptist in these caves.
But in the journals of Helena, the most famous pilgrim of all, Wahib found evidence he'd uncovered remains directly connected to John himself.
The Empress Helena reached the River Jordan, in which our Christ and God was baptized for our salvation. And when she had crossed the Jordan and found the cave in which the forerunner used to live, she caused a church to be made in the name of John the Baptist.
Look to the foundations of the church here. They built in front of the apse. The apse now is the cave, so the cave becomes the apse of the church.
But it was next to this church where Wahib found his most provocative, albeit unprovable, find of all.
And we excavate this small pit there, and we found a skull. Why a skull only without a body buried here? And the answer comes from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 6, when John the Baptist was beheaded. So possibly this is the skull of John the Baptist.
When Wahid published his report on the excavation, it was a lightning rod for controversy.
The Jordanians are claiming that this is the real site and are building a tourist center there. And people in Israel are claiming that this is the real site on the other side, and you have competing sites. And the reason they're competing probably has much more to do with contemporary economics and getting tourists to come to each site than it does with the reality of Jesus or John the Baptist having been active there. Certainly John the Baptist was likely active somewhere in that region, and the discovery shows that in the 4th and 5th century, there were Christians who believed that this was perhaps the site where John the Baptist was active. But whether or not the site is right or not is, I think, highly speculative.
But other scholars support Wahid, contending he's actually found tangible proof of the gospel accounts.
The site of Jesus' baptism is very clearly indicated in the Gospels. No doubt about it that John the Baptist was operating on the east bank of the Jordan across from Jericho. There's no question in my mind.
Despite the dispute and the explosive atmosphere of today's Arab-Israeli relations, the evidence was strong enough for Pope John Paul II to include the new site on his pilgrimage to the Holy Land in 2000. In the end, the Pope blessed not the east or west bank, but the waters of the Jordan. This much we know. Jesus emerged from these very waters a changed man. Now he would return home to the Galilee. He would call his own disciples to him, and he would begin his own mission, a mission that would ultimately end on the cross.